All right, so here I am in the user service, and I want to begin the process of allowing a user to create an account in our application because I'm only going to be able to provide a JWT token if a person has an account in our tables, our user table. So I got to actually create the user first before we can check if our filters and all that information is working and all that we just created is working. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a function called sign up user. And what I expect to provide to this from the controller, because remember, this service layer is being called from the controller. I expect from the controller to pass in an instance of the sign up DTO, right? This is going to be the data transfer object that was retrieved from the request, right? The user is going to send information from the clients, and that should include the email, the password that they want to create, the last name, first name, age, et cetera, et cetera. And if it passes the validation, remember, because we created some validation for this, if it passes the validation, then it's going to get to the service layer, and then we can begin the process of saving that user. And one design flaw that I just realized is I should have made this, instead of throwing an error in here, right? I should allow whatever is calling it to be able to handle how they want to throw an exception, right? So I'm going to make this optional. Right? I'm going to make this return an optional instead. And I'm going to remove this or else throw exception because this service layer method should just, return what is retrieved by the database in this case, right? But it should also give me the option to be able to handle what was returned by the database as well. So in this case, it's going to be optional, meaning if it's empty, I should be able to handle it how I want to. If it has a value, then I should be able to retrieve that value and do what I want to with it. And this is going to be important because as I open this sign up user method, it's going to allow me to manipulate it in a way that makes sense for this method. So first, what I got to do is I got to check if a user even exists in the user table, because if a user exists already, then they're unable to use that same email to sign up again. They just have to log in. But if a user doesn't exist, then I can continue the process of signing up. And to check if a user exists, I can just check by the email because the email has to be unique. Right? They're going to be one person using that email per user. So I can do that by, I'm going to use a one-liner, and I'm going to show exactly why I made this optional instead of just throwing the exception from here, which wasn't really a good design, to be honest. So I can do sign up DTO, which is, like I said, a data transfer object that's holding everything that I need related to the user. And I'm going to do dot email. I'm going to grab the email. And with this email, I'm going to do a nice little save call operator to let me run a piece of code. And based on this piece of code that I run in this block, it's going to return a value, right? So it's going to return, in this case, a Boolean, because I need it to be a Boolean to, run this if properly. So in this block of code, I'm going to do get user, and I'm going to provide it the value of it, or get user by email in this case. And I'm going to provide it the value of it. It meaning because I'm using this let on the email retrieved from the sign up DTO, that value from email is going to be passed to it, right? That's just how let works. And this is just not enough, right? Because it's going to return an optional in this case, which is not what we need for the if statement. But to help cancel that out, we can do dot get or no, meaning it's going to attempt to get the value or return no. Now, if it's unable to retrieve a value, then that means it's going to be equal to no, meaning that we can continue on with this logic. But if there is a value, meaning there is someone that exists by that email, then this is going to return false and it's not going to run this block. So let me just go over one more time so it makes sense, right? This sign up DTO has an email, and we're going to use that email to run this block of code, right? This email is going to be considered it, right? That's just how scope functions work in Kotlin. And with that value of email, we're going to attempt to get a user by that email. And because it's an optional that's being returned by get user by email, we're going to use this method of get or no. If we're able to get a value, that means this is going to be an instance of user that's being held here, which means that there is a user by that email. And we don't want to create a user again with the same email. They're going to be one user with the same email. There can't be multiple people using that same email. So in that case, we're not going to attempt to sign the user up. But if we're unable to get a user by that email, that means this is a fresh email. Anybody has dibs to use that email. So that is going to return null, and that's going to make this statement equal to true. And then we can start the process of signing the user up. Now, if this is confusing, you could just like separate this into like separate blocks. You can go ahead and just call, you can do user equal get user by, email, and, grab the value. But just to make it shorter, I just did it in one line, but it's really up to you. Now, what I got to do is, and I'm going to put this in comments, create user or create a user. So I'm going to create an instance of a user here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to do user dot last name is going to be equal to sign up DTO dot last name. So just by the design of Kotlin, Kotlin gets pretty angry when you try to utilize a field that is notable like this, even though we know because of the constraints that we made in the sign up DTO that it will never be null because we made rules to not be null or empty. But just because by design it's still considered nullable, Kotlin wants us to handle that properly. So to do that, even though I know at this point it's not going to be null or empty, I still want to make sure that it is handled properly just to make Kotlin happy. And to do that, I'm just going to use the Elvis operator on each one of these cases. So if it is by chance null, then we'll just throw an exception, unable to create a user, provide a last name, right? And we'll do that for each one of the fields, uh, just by design of how Kotlin does not like when you use no fields, right? You have to be able to handle that properly. We do not want null pointer exceptions. That's like the bane of everybody's existence, especially in Java. But in Kotlin, it's very strict on that. We're gonna do the same thing for first name. And honestly, I don't even know why I started with last name, but in some cultures that's fine. And then do first name, and then what we're gonna do is provide email. And we're gonna do age, which in this case we don't have to do a check. I believe that age was not nullable, right? It's a number, so we can just provide that. And then lastly, this is the money maker right here. We're gonna need an instance of the encoder to encode the password. And remember, we use that bean definition, so we should be able to inject the bcrypt encoder wherever we want. And I'm gonna do that here. So bcrypt password encoder. Now we have an instance of that here, and we can do password. Honestly, I should just do password encoder here, just to make my life easier. So now I can do password encoder, and I can do dot encode, and I can pass in the password. So sign up DTO dot password. So now that we have all the fields necessary for a user, last name, first name, email, age, and password that is encoded, we can go ahead and utilize another method that we have here called save user, which, as the name implies, is going to save the user. So save user passes the instance of user. Now, the second thing we're going to need to do is, remember I said that each user is going to have a default account when they sign up. So I want to create a default checking account that will be assigned or associated to the user. So I'm going to put create a default account. And right here, it's going to be account, and it's going to be equal to an instance of an account. And all I got to do is import account. All right, making sure that it comes from my entity package. And what I'm going to do is account.name is going to be equal to, and I'm going to try to make this as unique as possible. So $sign, and we're going to inject some strings into this. So user dot first name, which we have. And what I want to do is, by default, I'm going to make this a checking account. If you want to do savings, you can do that as well. It's really up to you. But account type dot checking, and it's going to grab the name of that enum value, which is just going to be checking. After that, I'm going to leave a space, and I'm going to add in something to make it as unique as possible. I'm going to use the uuid.random uuid. Now, if you want to spice up this project, what you could do is you could create another controller, and or even using the same user controller, go ahead and allow a user to be able to edit the name of their account. That would be a cool thing to add. Pretty simple too, but during this, I'm not gonna do that. So try to make it as unique as possible. Add the first name, add the type of account, and a UUID at the end. Second, what I'm gonna need to do is provide a balance. All right, so the balance just by default is just gonna be equal to 0.0. Then I gotta assign the account type. So account type is gonna be equal to account type, and we already know what type of account this is. It's gonna be a checking. And then lastly, what I want to do is I want to associate this account to a user. So I could do account.user, and it's going to be equal to the user that we just created. And after that, we have the necessary fields. We can do account repository, and I got to add that. I've got to inject that into here. So account repository, so that we can save this new account to our account table. So account repository.save, and we got to provide it the account. And the finishing touch will be associating the default account ID to the account that we just created. Because remember, each user can have a default account. That's why, and let me go to this definition of user. This is why I left a field here called default account ID, which you don't have to provide it a value. It can be null, but by default, since I make an account, right, I can provide it a value here of the ID. And this will be useful for one of the methods that we're going to create, which is to send money to somebody, right? If I send money to somebody, it's going to utilize the default account ID. So that is why we have this field. So let me go back to the service. So what I'm going to do is user.default account ID and make it equal to the account ID. And then I'm going to have to save that user again. So save user. And really it's just updating that specific field. There is that case where, well, this value is populated, meaning that it's going to ignore this whole if statement, right? I can't make a user with that email again because, it's already populated. So what I can do at the end of this if statement, meaning it got this far, I can go ahead and throw, and I got to make sure I use else, right? Because if I don't, then even if it gets past this point, it's still going to throw an exception, which is not good. So it's either going to do this piece or it's going to do this piece. So I'm going to throw an exception, and I'll create a custom exception for this as well when I create the global exception handler. But for now, it's going to be a generic exception, and it's going to just say, please log in, please. And that's pretty much it. So now I have the ability to sign the user up. It's going to create a user. It's going to create an account, associate that account to the user, and save that. So now I can go into the user controller and I can utilize this. So as of now, we only have one route, which is just sign up, but we're going to have to beef it up a little bit. All right, so we created the method in the user service, but I have to actually inject the user service into this controller to utilize that method. So what I'm going to do in the constructor is file user service, and it's going to be of type user service. The power of the service annotation. Now, guess what? We're going to need a couple more annotations to make sure that this works properly, right? We're going to need two annotations to be very specific. We're going to need the @request body annotation, and we're going to need the @valid annotation. Now, the @request body, as the name implies, we're expecting a request body, and we're going to take that request body and we're going to provide that into what we define next, which is going to be the sign up DTO, right? So it's going to take that request body and convert it into, or pass those values into the sign up DTO. Now, we have the @valid annotation to confirm that it matches the validation fields that was set in the sign up DTO. So the request body would take the data and convert it and try to structure it and put it into the sign up DTO. But the @valid makes sure that those values passes the rules that we set inside of the sign up DTO. Remember, we set up a whole bunch of validation rules here, like the length of the specific password or how old somebody can be to utilize our application, whether the field is empty or not. All of that will be validated from just that one validation of @valid. And if it doesn't passes, or if it doesn't matches the validation, it will return a response with the messages that we created. And if it does passes that validation, then it'll go inside of our function and it'll start running what we need to run. And in this case, what we do need to run is we gotta create a user. So we're gonna do user service dot sign up user, and I'm gonna pass in that instance of the sign up DTO. After signing up the user, what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna return a response entity, and it's gonna be of type string. Now, I know there are many ways that you can approach sign up. Sometimes people log in a user automatically and provide a token. Sometimes people send a piece of the information about a user. In my case, I just want to return a response entity and inform the user that they were created and provide the proper status code. So I'm going to do response entity, right? Open that up, provide a string, right? Because I defined the type as string, right? Whether you may have another model that you created, another data class, and create a structure of specifically how you want to structure the response. You can pass that here. But in this case, I'm just going to pass a string, and I'm going to provide it a status as well. So I'm going to put a comma in this case, and I'm going to do HTTP status dot created, which is just a 201, meaning we're letting the client know that this was created, providing the proper status code. Now, because of the nature of this sign up user, we know that this can throw an exception. So we want to be able to handle that properly for now, because we know we're going to have a global exception handler that handles that for us. But for now, I can do a try and catch. And what it can do is it's going to capture the exception. Because like I said, this could throw an exception for cases where a user is already found. So what I can do is I can return a response entity with the message, and I can return the status code of HTTP status dot conflict, which if I go into the status code, I believe this is 409, right? Yeah, it's 409. So if it's already created, it's going to throw an exception, and we can return that message back to the user and provide the proper status code, which in this case is 409. The user already created that, or somebody already has that email. So go ahead and log in. So we're able to sign up, and we know that Spring Security handles the login for us. So now we can go into Postman and test it out. All right, so before testing, I want to make some fixes because, like I said before, nobody's perfect. Shout out to Hannah Montana. And the first thing I got to fix is the login DTO. So it was a very basic mistake because I did actually add the constructor properties, but I forgot to add the actual properties that I wanted to add. So in this case is first going to be email, and the second one is going to be password. So I had to define the constructor properties. And what is constructor properties? Because I described it before, but just to go more in depth now that we're here, it's just to ensure that Jackson knows exactly which constructor properties to map to which JSON properties. So when we receive a request and when we convert that request into a login DTO, it needs to know which properties to convert to which value. So in this case, it's going to take the email and password properties and convert it into the email value here and the password value here. So this is just to help JSON map the information to the proper properties. And the fact is that Spring Security and Jackson were designed with Java in mind. And because it was used with Java in mind, there are some differences that Kotlin just doesn't understand because it was built with Java in mind. Yes, there's compatibility between Java and Kotlin, but it's not exactly one-to-one. There needs to be some conversion between them. So we utilize this constructor properties to help fix that issue. Now, there are other ways to fix it without using constructor properties. Like you can use, and let me put a comment here just in case you want to get it. You can use Jackson dash module dash Kotlin. You can get this dependency, and it'll provide better support for Kotlin data classes when it comes to handling conversion using Jackson between Kotlin's primary constructors. So you wouldn't even need this constructed properties if you utilize Jackson-module-Kotlin. But because we're using the regular Jackson, which is using a Java implementation, this is needed to help convert those properties to this login DTO. So that was the first mistake I made. Let me go on to the next one. So the next mistake I made was the user ID in the transaction entity. And it's because I use an underscore. Spring JPA does not like underscores. It doesn't understand it. So when I use a custom name method like find by user ID, it's not going to understand, or it's not going to know where user ID is because I use an underscore. For it to work, I have to utilize camel case. And let me fix that by doing that. So if I go back to the transaction entity, I'm going to change this to user ID, camel case, right? Make the second or any additional words start with a capital letter. Now, if you still want the column to utilize an underscore in the table, you can utilize another annotation called @column and just define the name, right? And that's going to just equal to user underscore ID. So now you get the best of both worlds. We can get the name custom methods using Spring JPA, and as well as have the specific name that we want in the table using underscore. So this is for JPA, the camel case, and this is just for the table with underscore. And then finally, because of the fact that I changed this from using underscore to using camel case, I have to go into the service, the fun service, which is using transaction, and change those values to utilize the camel case instead of the underscore. So let me go into the fun service, and you can see that it is still using the underscore. It takes some time to load there, but it's okay. But now we got to convert it to using the camel case. So user ID for all of these. And honestly, I probably could have did, find and replace all of them, but it's fine. And that is it. And honestly, I don't know why this one is still angry, but that should be fine. Transaction.user ID. Sometimes IntelliJ is just weird like that, but that should be it. And we should be able to test the application now. Now I'm going to go ahead and run the application so we can check if login and sign up works. So let me go ahead and run it. All right, so now that it's confirmed that this is building properly, always make sure that your Docker instance is running properly as well. Go ahead into Postman and try it out. All right, so here I am in Postman, and I already have a request opened up. And you don't have to use Postman. If you want to use a curl command, you can do that as well. But I just find that Postman is just easier to show people. So that's why I'm using Postman in this case. And here in Postman, I am defining the HTTP verb to be post, because remember, sign up is creating based on the data that we're sending. So it has to be a post request. And the URL is going to utilize localhost. We're running this locally on port 8080 because that's the default port of our application using Springboot. But you could change the server port if you want to any other ones. But we're using 8080. And the endpoint that we defined is /sign up, right? And for the information that we're sending to create, I set the setting to raw. Right? We're not using form data. I'm sending a raw JSON, and I chose the JSON value from the dropdown. You might get text by default, but make sure you use the dropdown to select JSON. And then for the values, open up some brackets and started putting the key value pair of the JSON, which in this case is going to be first name, last name, email, password, and age. Now I'm going to try out a bad route. And honestly, I don't think the error is going to be handled properly just yet because we don't have the exception handler, but I just want to show that it's not going to go through. So let me put 15, because remember, you got to be at least 16 to sign up for this application. So I press send. And here I am, I'm getting 403 currently because the error is not being handled properly. Create the global exception handler will send a message back to the user to inform them that, their age is not, big enough for them to be able to use our application. You have to be at least 16. But if I go back into the application, I'll be able to see that error. So here I am in the application. You can see that there's a validation issue. And if I go a little bit more to the right, you can see that the sign up DTO, it was rejected based on the age value. So internally, the validation is working. It's just that in the future, we're going to make sure that we have to handle that validation error properly. And that's why the global exception handler is going to be very important. But at least we know that it's actually validating as expected. Now, I'm going to use a proper value. I'm going to go back to the 24 age. And I have a first name, I have a last name, I have an email, and I have a password. The age is proper. And you press send. Boom. We get a 201. Remember the status code of 201 created. And we get a value of created, right? A string. So that's working as expected. And now if I go into login, I can now, and making sure that the email matches up and the password matches up. And even if it doesn't, right? If I send the wrong password and I press send, I expect to get an error as well. Please check your email password. Remember, that's a message that we provided. So this is expected. This is from the unsuccessful attempt, authentication attempt. And remember, it's going to return a status of 401 and as well as the current timestamp. So that's working as expected. And if I put the proper password and I put login, I get the token as expected, right? And I just realized that you can make this in the token response, you can make this access token if you want, instead of just token, but it's really just personal preference. Usually I'm used to saying access token. I should have put access token, but that's a quick fix. You can go into token response and put access token instead. But we can see that we're getting a JWT token. So we'll utilize this token with our future request in the authorization header by, and I can show an example here. Let me do get transactions. If I go into the header, you can see authorizations in the header. The value is going to be bearer space and the actual JWT token. And you can see that's already, I'm using a variable here, but you can see that the current value in the variable is the JWT token that we just logged in as, right? Because the script that I have in this login, and I can show you guys the script, is going to retrieve the token value from this response and set a variable of called JWT with that value so that in future requests, I'll be able to just use this variable of JWT and it's going to inject that value into the authorization header. It just makes my life so much easier. Instead of logging in, copying and pasting it in, it will just utilize this variable instead. But this is the format that you're going to need in the future to utilize all the other future routes, right? Of transfer, withdrawal, deposit, anything else, you're going to need the authorization header with the bearer and the actual token, right? Because if you don't, then you're not going to be allowed to use the application because you have to be authorized to use the application. So going back to authentication versus authorization, the user was able to prove that they are who they say they are by passing an email and a password, and they received a token. And with this token, they're going to be able to authorize themselves by sending this token in the header. So we're able to see that validation works. We're able to see that an unsuccessful attempt will show the user that, okay, please use a proper email and password. And honestly, another route that I forgot to show was, what if I attempt to sign up with an already used email? Well, let me press send on this. And you can see that the string says, please log in, right? It's a conflict. You already have an account, please log in. So I forgot to test that route, and there it is. Now that we have a token, and now that we're able to authorize an individual to use our application, I will have the ability now to update the services and controllers in the way that I want to. But before updating the services and controller, I want to go over transactions and transaction logs. Since this is a funds-based application, I want to make sure that the data remains consistent because there's money involved, right? If someone's retrieving money, I want to make sure that the money in the account is the money that's in the account. If there's any inconsistencies, there will be a problem, right? Whether it's not having enough money, even though a deposit just occurred, or withdrawing money that's just not there. I want to make sure that the money in our accounts are consistent. So we're going to have to utilize transaction and transaction logs to make sure that the data is consistent. Transactions will help us make that possible. So go ahead and stay logged in, no pun intended.